Adam Smith said all wealth is derived from land, labor, and capital. Grocery prices and interest rates get all the attention on the news, but in the opinion of a few obscure economists who happen to be right, nothing else in an economy can get started before land does its thing first. Growing crops, lumber, replenishing aquifers, storing fossil fuels, or just looking shiny are some of the things land does to support the global financial system and support all of our lives. What does that have to do with Fort Smith? Well, we have a lot of land and it affects the price of everything. Let's look under the hood and poke at some stuff. Don't worry, I'll do the dirty work, I just need you to hold the flashlight. Anyone can access public tax records. You add them all up and Sebastian County is worth about $7.5 billion, $5.9 billion of which is in Fort Smith. What else does the data say? Most importantly, the average acre of land within the city limits is worth about $250,000. If your house sits on a half-acre lot with a zestimate of $125,000, you're painfully average. But fear not, because this isn't just a study of average. Let's look at some of the outliers too. On the lower end of the spectrum are parcels like this, 5900 South 58th Street. It's just an empty field. It's 6 acres and worth $295,000, giving it a price per acre of $49,000. If we're just talking about empty space, the most valuable piece of empty space in the entire city is this parking spot. At a size of 0.004 acres and the land underneath it worth $12.5 million per acre, it's worth about $53,000. If it were an apartment, it would rent for about $266 a month. There are approximately 900 free parking spaces in downtown Fort Smith like this one. If they were all worth this much, the city's lost revenue from subsidized free parking is about $239,000 a month or $2.9 million a year, which is enough to repave about 2 miles of roadway the size of Garrison Avenue, buy 5 new water slides for Parrot Island, install a 10-acre dog park, or fund the public library tax allocation for 2 years. But what makes one empty space so valuable and the other so cheap? It's the productivity of land around it. As real estate agents say, location, location, location. Or what they should be saying, land, land, land. And the land use around this parking spot is extremely productive. The First National Bank building is the most valuable piece of real estate for its size in Fort Smith, with a price per acre of about $13 million. But Andy, why are we talking about value and value per acre at that? Because we have to discuss expenses, and in a city where the cost of everything is based on linear feet, measuring value by an amount of space gives us a common denominator to compare parcels. Running a city is expensive. In fact, the operating expenses in Fort Smith are around $180 million a year, and it all runs through the streets. There are 510 miles of streets, so each mile of Fort Smith costs roughly $351,000 a year for all city services, or $66.48 per foot. If the painfully average house also has 60 painfully average feet of frontage, the city spends this much in operating expenses to account for how much space that house takes up. Since that expense is shared with the neighbor across the street, it's actually more like this much. So far, we've covered value and expenses. There's one more piece of math left to do. It's revenue for the city. And the city mostly collects revenue in 2 ways, property taxes and sales tax. The property tax is no mystery. It's where I'm pulling this data from anyway. We just need to manually calculate it for our hypothetical average house. We already discussed it's worth $125,000, and with a 20% assessment ratio in Sebastian County, its assessed value is $25,000, multiplied by our millage of the theoretical tax bill is $1,451.45. Most of that tax bill actually goes to the county though. The city actually only collects 70 cents for every $100 of assessed value, or $250. We also pay a 9.5% sales tax in Sebastian County, of which the city of Fort Smith gets to collect 2%, meaning the painfully average house in Fort Smith needs to spend $70,595.50 within the city limits of Fort Smith to pay for their city services every year. If our painfully average house also makes the painfully average household income of $52,000 and paid 0 income taxes and spent every single penny on taxable goods within city limits, the city loses this much to have this house within city limits. If the city loses a little bit of money on a filled house, it loses a lot of money on a blighted or vacant one. How can this be? How can the city lose so much money and stay fiscally solvent? Well, first of all, it can't stay physically solvent in the long term. But in the short term, we're on life support because of government bailouts and sales tax from people who live outside city limits. Parcels like First National Bank subsidize everyone else. It's getting harder and harder to buy a house these days. We can simultaneously help the housing market and city finances by incentivizing builders to make housing that looks like First National Bank.